Hi there, I'm Johannes from the JS Kongress team. We had audio issues in the first minutes during the live stream, so we recorded this intro afterwards. And here is the intro where we had no audio initially. Welcome to the second episode of JS Kongress Meets Friends. This time we are talking about the Chrome DevTools and beyond, where we cover the different topics from architecture to history, workflow and quality, team and feedback, design and accessibility, and last but not least, about WebAssembly debugging. I'm happy to welcome Kim, Mathias, Paul, and Peter from the Chrome DevTools team in this episode. So here we go. I'd like to start with a brief warm-up question. So Kim, who are you, what are you doing, and how it's going in the home office for you?
Hi, I'm Kim. I recently joined the Chrome DevTools team, and I was an intern on WASM runtime before. And yeah, I'm working on WASM debugging right now, and yeah, I'm doing well. Juggling between taking care of my child and working in between.
All right. Matthias, who are you? What are you doing and how is it going in the home office for you?
Hey, I'm Mathias. I used to work on V8 and now I work on Chrome DevTools here in Munich, where it's still raining, indeed. For DevTools, I lead the efforts on design and accessibility, and I also work on Puppeteer, which is something we could talk about later. As to how it's going in my home office, I'm kind of an introvert, so in normal circumstances, I don't feel the need to go out all the time. But now that I kind of don't even have the option anymore, it sucks. So yeah, I can't wait for this thing to be over.
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Johannes.
Sorry. Right now, Paul, who are you? What are you doing? And how is it going for you in the home office?
Good, thanks. Yeah, so as you say, I'm Paul. I am based in London. Unlike everybody else, I'm in London, which you'll be pleased to hear is also rainy. I used to be in developer relations, and then I moved to working on the DevTools team, I don't know, something like a year ago, 9 months ago, something like that. And I work on the architecture and testing particularly. That's my main focus with a couple of folks in London particularly. And how's it going? Well, my house is actually a building site right now. We decided to do some building work right before the pandemic hit. And we haven't been able to make progress for a while. So it's been weird living on a building site. And yeah, I don't recommend it. But there you go. That's just life, isn't it?
I see. Peter, who are you? What are you doing and how is it going in the most colorful home office in this round?
Yes. So hi, I'm Peter. I'm the design lead on DevTools. So previously I come from a visual design background and then transitioned into UX design at Google. And yeah, how's it going at home? So as you see, I'm working in a greenhouse. I decorated with as many plants as possible. So it's going good, at least for me.
All right. Thanks for the quick introduction round. I would say let's kick off and start with the questions we've collected. So the first topic is about architecture and history. So the first question is directed to Paul. Can you please give us a brief overview about what DevTools are and how they can help engineers?
Okay, so the DevTools is a web app primarily that is embedded with Chrome. It comes with the Chrome binary, and it allows you to inspect the current page. So it helps developers by giving them insights about what elements are in the page, what the JavaScript is doing, the performance, the accessibility, what styles are applied to the page. It gives them all that insight just by them sort of right-clicking on the page and saying inspect element, and it gives them all that at their fingertips. So that's what it's there to do. It's there to help people build web apps, really, and sites.
Okay. We have a quick interruption because we got the message that audio is not available in the live chat. Can someone please update me?
It's working apparently.
Okay, it's working again.
Okay.
All right. So The next question is, do you know how the idea came up to ship Chrome with native DevTools? Some keywords like, I think Firebug was one of the first things I remember in my times, but I'd be curious about the history behind it, how it came up.
Yeah, so the reason Chrome had DevTools from the very first version is because it's a fork of the WebKit project, at least the Chromium project is. So it used to be that Google and Apple were working together on WebKit, and at some point they realized that they had different vision for the project, so they decided the best way to fix that issue is by forking. And then WebKit and Blink became two separate projects. And so we basically, in Chromium, we inherited the WebKit inspector code, which was the DevTools at the time in WebKit, that are still the very early version of the Safari inspector right now. And also the DevTools code base is still based on that. So this is a code base that is 14 to 15 years old right now. And that's how DevTools ended up being in Chrome. But I think the question you were getting at is, how did DevTools become a thing in browsers that ships with browsers, right? And I actually remember those days before this happens. I remember having Internet Explorer 4 open, going to my page and then typing JavaScript : alert something, just to get something to appear or like to interact with the page in some way, because that was the only way I knew how, other than viewing the source directly, which I still do to these days, actually. And I think, yeah, Firebug indeed was a big boon. It was a browser plugin that was created by developers to fix some of these issues and to make it possible to at least interact with the page a little bit more closely. And there was another extension that I remember using. I think it was the Web Developer Toolbar by Chris Pedrick. It had all these cool keyboard shortcuts that I remember using. And so I think what happened is that a lot of experimentation happened in these browser add-ons, these optional plugins that people could install. And based on that, browser developers were like, yeah, what if we took some of these ideas and shipped them with the browser, then we could actually do some of these things in a more efficient way that is not possible in an extension. And I think that's what happened.
I see. So I'm a software engineer as well, and I'm all the time super curious about the architecture behind. So can you give a quick overview about the high-level architecture? Because like there are so many things which can be done in DevTools, from the inspector, I think everybody knows, to the performance measurement, to so many other things. So what's the high-level architecture of the DevTools?
So the DevTools is a web app, as Paul has already mentioned, and the DevTools frontend that the developer is normally interacting with is talking to various backends in order to accomplish tasks. So one backend, for example, is the V8 backend. The V8 backend is basically everything that answers to JavaScript and WebAssembly. So for example, if you are typing in an expression that you want to evaluate, it's the V8 backend that we are talking to. So between the front end and the back end, there's CDP. It's a Chrome DevTools protocol. The CDP is specifying the methods, the requests, the responses that can be used in order to communicate between them. And the DevTools frontend is not the only one that can actually use the CDP in order to control Chrome. One example was already mentioned before by Mathias is Puppeteer. And Puppeteer allows you to write end-to-end tests in JavaScript by controlling a Chrome browser instance, for example.
I see. So DevTools is not only for web apps. As we know, we can debug our Node.js applications as well. So what's the history behind extending the DevTools for making use of Node.js debugging? Okay, there is no link behind.
Okay. I guess I'll take this question. So as Kim explained, there's this Chrome DevTools protocol, and there's really no reason why only DevTools should be able to send these commands to the backend. Anyone can do it. That's why you also have Puppeteer as a library, which is a wrapper on top of the Chrome DevTools protocol that makes it very easy to use this and to drive a Chrome instance from within Node.js using a very nice and modern API. And the same thing applies to Node.js. Once you know about this protocol, and specifically for Node.js, you probably mostly care about the JavaScript part of the protocol. So things like setting breakpoints in your code and evaluating a snippet of JavaScript. you can build the same possibilities that DevTools already support within Node.js as well. So through this protocol, it is now possible to use the DevTools UI to debug your Node.js code instead of the web app that you're inspecting.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a matter of sending the proper commands and interacting in the right way that is described by the protocol.
I'm curious, like, are there any numbers? Do you have any numbers about the usage, how the DevTools are used for debugging Node and for debugging web apps? Do you collect any numbers?
I mean, Chrome has this, Chrome can collect some telemetry for if people actively opt into this in an anonymized fashion. So we do have some measurements, but I don't think we have a metric specifically for this. In fact, the metrics that we have from within DevTools are fairly limited from as far as I know. And this is actually one area where I think we can improve a little bit more, because if we have more fine-grained details about which panels are the most popular, we can figure out where to invest a little bit more of our time.
I see. So is there an API I can use to automatically use DevTools features on a given Chrome?
Oh, yeah. So this goes back to Puppeteer a little bit, because many of the features you would find in DevTools are things like, I want to preview what the page would look like with print styles instead of my screen media. There is a setting in DevTools in the renderer panel that lets you do this. And so because it might be useful to do this kind of thing as part of an automated test, there's also a Puppeteer API that behind the scenes just sends the same Chrome DevTools protocol commands, so that you can now write a Puppeteer script that says, okay, open the browser, navigate to this URL, emulate print styles, and then take a screenshot and save it somewhere for me. And that script would just be 4 lines of JavaScript. So the same thing goes for many of the features that you will find in DevTools. If we deem it useful as part of this automated testing scenario, or maybe even for other use cases like scraping web pages, then we will add a Puppeteer API on top of the CDP API so that developers can easily use it.
Okay, so when I'm using Puppeteer for my end-to-end tests, I can make use of not all, but some of them, and automate them as well. That's pretty cool.
Exactly. And you can use the whole protocol. You can also send raw protocol commands, but it's just not very nice to do so. It's nicer if there's a dedicated first-class API, because doing it the other way doesn't feel very JavaScripty.
Okay, so we started the first question with the architecture and the history behind. So when it comes to architecture is like living all the time. So how is the DevTools architecture evolved over the last years, and what are some of the main pain points in the past or currently?
For, depending on how you look at it, some of it's been around for up to 10 to 15 years. And that means that the code that you have, the code that would have been written 10, 15 years ago in web is very different to the code you'd write today, because best practices change, new patterns sort of evolve, and it's just, like you say, architecture is a living thing. Now, the size of the DevTools front end in particular, we're talking about an awful lot of JavaScript that's in play. And so it's not just a case. In fact, one of the words that we try to avoid in my team is the word just, because in the size of code base we're talking about, there is no just. And I'll give you one example. So recently the web got ES modules so that we could do imports and exports around the place. Before that, there wasn't a way really to do on the platform anything that looked like modules. And one of the things we wanted to do was move the code base to ES modules because it's a good thing for us to have. The tooling supports it, like Visual Studio Code understands it really well. But there is no just. So we can't just migrate to ES modules. There's a lot of things that need to change, like the tool chain. The actual code itself is written in a way that was before ES modules and expects certain things to be in certain places. And so the largest pain point we typically have is migration. So as my team is particularly tasked with keeping the architecture and the testing in a good shape, and we decide, there's this new platform primitive that would help us here, would make the software better. We have to migrate everybody across to that without breaking DevTools. And that applies to the people using DevTools every day, which obviously is incredibly important, but also the rest of the team, because if the rest of the team is trying to work on the DevTools code base and we're busy just changing the architecture, we could break their patches and we could break their workflow. So we have to be very careful about how we do it. And we have to do it at the scale of a very, very large web app. So it is constantly evolving, as you said. It's challenging to make sure that we make decisions as well that will have a long lifespan, because at the scale we're doing them and the timescales it takes us to get them done, what we don't want to do is make a quick decision that we would have to undo later on. So we're sort of constantly trying to understand how much a technology would give us if we were to use it, and then as we migrate people, to make sure that we don't break anybody, which is always a challenge.
Migrating an architecture, that's a good keyword for the last question for this topic. Like in my team, the last weeks, like technical debt is more and more a topic. I'm curious, how is your team handle technical debt in this scale and for this lifespan?
It's a constant question. I think that's the way it goes, because the best practice today can be tomorrow's tech debt. And I don't mean that rudely. It doesn't mean anybody who's coding badly at that point. It's just that things change and things do get better. And you can look at tech debt as, oh, somebody made a mistake, but that's not often what it is. Often it's the constraints they had at the time. And sometimes the platform didn't support the thing they wanted to do. So in our case, sort of to repeat myself, I suppose, a little bit, we try and take a very tactical view on it. Is that thing just different, or is it actually bad in some way? As in, somebody's had to code around a problem that, say, the platform didn't do something. And is it worth fixing that? Or is it worth delaying that until some other thing is in place? So we're forever having conversations. And that's actually the main thing I think we've just hit time and again. It's so much about the conversation, about making sure that people both understand the trade-off and the trades that you're making back and forth. Like, we're not going to fix that now because we'd like to do this instead, or we think we should fix that next, or we should change that over there. And then trying to just make sure, as I say, that you do it in a considerate and thoughtful way so that you don't break anything. But there is no sense in which you're going to go, right, we're done. Because while the platform moves, you're going to have new things to try, new tools that you need to add. If you're us, we're adding things to the product. We're trying better ways of working. And that just means that inevitably there's always going to be some form of change that you need to manage.
Mm-hmm. So we are closing this topic, but I just got a notification that the first 2 minutes have been without audio. So I would like to ask the first question again. This is directed to you, Paul. So can you give us a brief overview of what the DevTools are and about how they can help engineers?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that one again. What would I have said? I think I said nice things about DevTools. So DevTools is a web app that we ship with the Chrome binary. It's a surprise to a lot of people that it is a web app. When you open the DevTools front end, you are looking at a web app. So you can actually inspect DevTools with DevTools, which is always a fun thing. It's like, yeah, Mathias is like, and rightly so. So it's there, and it speaks to the various backends that we have in Chrome for like V8 and for Blink. And it's requesting information about the page that's being inspected. So if you're building a web app or you're building a website and you want to know what elements you've got, what styles are in place, what the JavaScript's doing, what your performance looks like, your accessibility, we have tools in the DevTools that are designed to help you through that process, to understand your web app and to help you through the process of building it and making the best possible app or site that you can.
All right, thanks for answering the first question. Feels a bit weird, but now we have everything with audio. So let's go from architecture and history to the next topic. The main topic is workflow and quality. So one of the most interesting questions I think a lot of people are having is like, how do you build the UI of the DevTools? And are you using any libraries therefore?
Unfortunately, you are hearing quite a lot from me, so I can only apologize to everybody that you're getting a lot of Paul time. My team was probably going to nod along and like, yeah, we hear from him a lot. But how are we building the UI? Well, I think our constraints they're not unique, but they are probably unusual in the sense that the DevTools front end is a long-standing web app. And that means that we need to pick technologies that we feel have, say, the next 10 years in them or more. And so our preferences are normally to use the platform primitives where they're available, because the platform moves at a slower rate than libraries and frameworks. And anybody who's worked on the web for a while knows that the rate of change in the web is extremely high. And that means that if you were to pick a library or a framework that's popular today, in a year, 2 years, 5 years, you might find that it's not. And at the scale that we were talking about before in terms of tech debt and change, that would be perhaps an unwise technical decision. So that's the kind of the background philosophy almost that we have. The second thing that we want to do is we want to maintain control in the sense that we need the flexibility to do certain things at certain times and know that we're going to do certain tasks at certain times. And so if you find that a piece of software, say a framework, is going to invert the control so that it calls you rather than you call it, then there's a potential problem there. So we do like libraries, and we do want to use libraries, and we do make the best use of libraries where we can, generally speaking. But the idea has to be that not only is it that we think it's maintainable for the long term, secondarily, if we need to replace it with something else, that we can. And thirdly, that it allows us to maintain control over the life cycle of the application so that we can call into it, it will do the task, and it'll come back. And if there's a problem with it, we can swap it out and so on. I think that answers the question. Yeah, I mean, you can look through the DevTools codebase if you want to see the kinds of libraries that we are looking at.
Okay. So regarding quality and workflow, how is your Q&A look like? Like, which actions are you taking in order to ensure you ship the best possible quality?
This is another one for me, isn't it? Well, testing. I mean, this is not the most exciting answer that you could imagine, but it is the most sort of truthful, I suppose. Like, if you don't write tests, you don't know what your software is doing. And that means that writing high quality testing and investing in your testing and infrastructure and your architecture and those kinds of things are the long-term best play that you have. Now, we also happen to have a wonderful community of developers generally who give us good feedback. And that's actually really helpful for us. So we can speak to framework people, we can speak to web developers in all kind of walks of life. And that gives us a fairly good signal on what are they struggling with, what do they care about. So we can use that in combination with the fact that we're trying to build high quality software with good testing and infrastructure that supports us to do that. Sort of hopefully comes together into something that, you know, genuinely adds value to everybody every day.
I see. So the discussions and the feedback you're collecting, where is this communicated? Like, do you communicate that on GitHub as well, where the whole source code is available?
So which bit? How do we communicate which bit?
With the framework people, with the library people, in order to collect the feedback? Like, is there...
Yeah, it tends to be a lot more ad hoc. So we will tend to set up calls with people if if that makes sense. Or sometimes we will just simply look at what they're creating. I mean, there are some wonderful tools for Vue and React in particular that augment the dev tools, and that gives us a fair idea of, hey, what are these people trying to get done? What things make sense in their world? So it's a fairly informal thing, I would say.
Okay, the next question is very workflow related. So when you add new features to the DevTools, like what's the workflow behind, like who is structuring the issues or the feature, who is taking care of the requirements, who is doing the UI and the UX? Is there A/B testing ongoing? How do you handle new features, like the rough workflow from the idea until it gets shipped?
That sounds the question from me. Okay, so I'd say like the design process in DevTools, or the process from idea to production, is pretty unique. So it's definitely not like the traditional process, like top down. You have a design team, and they're creating like designs and handing it off to developers, and at some point it's unstable. So it's rather more the opposite way around. It's like from the bottom up. So you can't develop such a super complex tool just by your own, or probably not even a team alone has enough knowledge to cover everything. So you constantly need to collaborate with experts, not only at Google, but also other companies, other browsers even, so really across the globe. So we have like a tool internally to make this collaboration happen. We could just call it design docs. It's basically just a Google Doc after a certain format. So everybody can start such a design doc and just write like a basic outline what a new feature might look like. And we use this a lot to collaborate with experts on different topics, because usually it gets so technical. You really need expertise outside of your team, like even if it's especially if it's about security and so on. So everybody can come up with such a design doc. So there's not like a single person that sets up the roadmap, but you can already like imagine there is a lot of stuff coming up. If like everybody is writing feature requests, and like at some days you have like, I don't know, there are so many design docs just popping up. I can't even read them all. So you need like some workflow to focus. And we also have this in place. So we define like focus area for each year. We want to improve DevTools. So for example, in this year, it's like design and accessibility, or WebAssembly is like a huge topic we want to focus on. And if we find like a feature that plays into one of those areas, we prioritize this higher, and we spend a little bit more time on this. So it doesn't mean that we neglect everything else, but we have like our focus. So those design docs are also like the space where the UX work or UI work happens. So in a lot of features in general, a lot of stuff is happening under the hood. So not everything is involving UI. But sometimes like my job is just to take a look and find out in which part of the workflow, of the developer workflow, it makes sense to surface something where we can actually be useful for the developer, not intrusive. So sometimes it's really just about making sense of things. And this all happens like in design docs. So, but yeah, like how does it land in production? So eventually the design doc hits like one of those focus groups, gets developed, and will land in Canary. So from Canary, it's like our pre-beta build, everybody can try out, and we like test functionality in Canary. So it's like a safe playground for us to get early feedback from the community. So the user group is large enough that it's meaningful feedback, but also it's not a stable one, and we won't break everybody's browsing experience. And we monitor the feedback from Canary really closely and start iterating on and on until it hits stable. So yeah, I'd say this is like the rough outline of how like a feature comes to production. right. And like for people who really want to try out like how stuff will work and look in the next upcoming Chrome versions. Mute.
like KPIs. And these objective key results are set for the quarter, for example, and these are the ones that we want to achieve until then. And that's exactly what we use in order to measure the performance. You're muted.
Yes, I just got the notification. We had a break in the stream, but it's still running again. So how do you involve the developer community's needs and wishes when it comes to new products, features, and involvement?
Right. I mean, it's pretty difficult if you have like such a huge user base to really go down to the individual. But we always try like to be really close to our user base. So what helps us tremendously are people in big dev relations positions, so that they really foster like relationships with their community and help to like distill like the opinion that's out there and what's really bugging people and what's really in demand right now and make it actionable for us. So we don't need to like go through 1 gazillion Twitter feeds to really filter it out. But in general, like the whole team has having a close look on our Twitter feed and in general what comes into the bug reports and the Chrome bugs. So this is generally, it will be written, so we monitor it closely.
There is one shout out from the Technic behind. Let's please not unmute us because Marco, who is doing the Technic in the background, has to reconnect the audio sources then all the time.
Oh.
Sorry, Marco. Another question regarding the team and the feedback. So do you stay in regular contact with the engineers, with the product managers, and people who are working on other browsers, DevTools?
Well, actually, yes, we do. I think this might come like to a surprise to some people, but actually we are like in regular contact with most big browser vendors. So especially if we like develop a new feature, for example, lately we had like experts, like engineers from Firefox with us in it, or we had like experts, engineers and PMs from Microsoft in there as well. So yeah, definitely something like DevTools doesn't happen in a vacuum. We are like very well connected with others.
Okay, so let's go to the next topic, which is about design and accessibility. So layout debugging has been one of the weak spots in Chrome DevTools, and in particular, Firefox DevTools have done a better job here. Do you have any plans to tackle that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's definitely true. I mean, Firefox really did a great job in doing this, especially like the grid implementation and Flexbox implementation. But I think I mentioned it earlier, like design is like one of the key areas. And we have been working really closely with Microsoft over the last month, actually, on grid implementation. So which is actually pretty cool. Like tomorrow we will demo our first preview of CSS Grid. So if you want to see it, you should really take a close look on our Twitter account because we will demo it tomorrow. Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, take a look on Twitter. Who are interested about the Twitter handles from Peter, Kim, Paul, and Matthias. We've posted them on twitter.com/JS Kongress. So the next question is also design and accessibility related. You recently shipped support for color version difference emulation as a means to improve accessibility support. Can you provide some details here?
Websites to pick a color palette that is accessible. And so by adding this new functionality to DevTools, where you can almost put yourself a little bit closer to being in the shoes of a person who suffers from such a thing, you can now visually see what is going on and how they might experience the colors that you choose. And so by doing this and by simulating several of these color vision deficiencies, you can ensure that what you design is accessible for everyone, not just for people with perfect vision.
There is one question specifically to Peter. What or how you think how you can improve the Chrome DevTools UI?
Right. So at the moment, how we are approaching this, like we are refactoring a lot of features in the DevTools UI. So it's like what happens to all Pro Tools at one moment, right? You add and add features, but you're really reluctant to remove them because you will abandon some users using it. Like every Pro Tool, like Photoshop, the Excels, the After Effects, they all have been there at one point. So what we are like actually thinking about is not so much like improving the style of like text elements, but rather refactoring the UI a bit. So one example, we want to declutter the console a lot because right now the console is like full of messages which are not really actionable. So we want in the future to come up with a new panel, the issues panel, which actually gives you all the issues with your website in a really nice, snappable, actionable format. So those are the things we are like at the moment thinking about for improving.
Okay. So let's go to the next topic, which is about WebAssembly debugging. WebAssembly launched back in 2017, but there was only very basic debugging support until recently. So what is the timeline here and what we can expect here?
Yeah, so what we want to do is to make sure that debugging raw WASM actually comes along with an environment that makes sense for WASM. So this means changing the views that are already existing. So for example, the scope view that makes sense for WASM, using consistent WASM text format across all our views, having a better memory view, but also to make it possible to set breakpoints across threads and allow for like seamless profiling. And for these features, some of them will already be available in May in Chrome 84, but others will continue to ship by the end of the year. But we also want to go a step further. So we actually want to introduce a language server that makes use of C++ force symbols. And the idea behind this is that we don't only want to have access to static information, but also to dynamic information. So you don't only see the source locations when you're debugging in C++ using WASM, but you also have the possibility to evaluate expressions, which is very valuable when actually debugging an application. And we want to support large-scale applications in C++ with this language server. And the plan to ship on this side is that we want to have the basic C++ symbol server with capabilities to step in C++ by the end of June, Chrome 85, but want to improve on that with live expressions support and improved scope view in Chrome 86, 87, which is August, October. So the big difference to the current source map-based debugging approach is that the source maps only give you the source location. It doesn't work also with inlining, and you cannot evaluate expressions. And that's exactly what the new symbol server will give you.
Mm-hmm. So Ingvar announced, I hope I spelled it correctly, Ingvar? Yes, announced an improvement and an improved solution at the Chrome Dev Summit that uses native DWARF debugging information. Is this an extension of that?
No, it's not an extension. So the solution that Ingvar presented at the Chrome Dev Summit was rather a proof of concept that we can actually use dwarf information to debug. And the symbol server is a new solution, it's a file solution that we want to present that gives you all the features that I've been talking about with the dynamic information and a solution that scales with large applications, because the solution that was presented before was actually running in Devtools frontend itself, and just handling the massive amount of dwarf data wouldn't be scalable in Devtools itself.
By the way, scalable. Google Earth recently announced that they made the switch to WebAssembly. Debugging on a large code base like that probably comes with different challenges than toy examples, I suppose.
Yeah, so big applications means also a lot of dwarf data. And a lot of dwarf data needs to be parsed, needs to be read, needs to be found in order to find the symbol, the names that you're using for debugging. And this is especially difficult if, for example, the data is not indexed, so that you have to actually read through everything. We also need better mechanisms for stepping and showing big scopes, because now that you actually have a large application, you have a huge scope, and we need to find out how to show the scope in a way that is accessible to the developer. And then it's also about profiling. Profiling with big data is also difficult.
Okay. So that's it with the last prepared question for the WebAssembly debugging topic. We got some questions now from the people who are watching the live stream, and let's start with one of the first, which is DevTools are getting more and more IDE features, editing files, etc. I would be interested to know how they think that this will continue to develop.
Who wants to take it?
DevTools are getting more and more IDE features, like editing files, having them mapping to the local file system, changing things in the code directly without going to the IDE. So what do you think? Like, how will this develop? I think the question is directed to you, Paul.
Then we would look at those features at that time. So if it sounds like I'm avoiding the answer, it is a little bit, because as I say, we tend to respond and think through before we just commit ourselves to one particular path, and that's just how it works really for us.
Okay. So let's go to the next question from the audience. It's WebAssembly related. So what features can we expect for WebAssembly in DevTools? Will there be any special support for various languages and for WebAssembly?
So regarding the features, I guess I've talked about that before regarding various languages. So when we previously talked about the symbol server, I talked about C++ symbol server. And so that is our focus for this year. We want to focus on C++ this year because C++ is applications. We concentrate on large, high-performance applications, and that's exactly what we want to support this year. After this year, we were thinking about maybe also adding support for Kotlin, but let's see. It's on our agenda. But other than that, we don't know yet.
Okay. There is another question directed to Peter. Do you test new tools with outside users? And if so, how do you choose the users to try out new features for UX tweaks and so on?
Actually, that's a good question. So at the moment, actually, there is not so much testing happening with outside users, and it's definitely like an issue we are tackling at the moment. So it's quite difficult to find like the appropriate testing users. So if you ask like a huge group of developers, hey, who of you might want to test new features, you will get like the super pro users usually, and you will get feedback that's usually very, very pro focused. And right now we're trying to find ways to find like different user segments to test against new features. For example, also non-developers, because DevTools is also used by non-developers, right? So we want to actually see how those people, like other designers, use DevTools to achieve certain stuff. And right now we are figuring out how we can set up like something that's scalable and gives good insights for us. Yeah.
From another angle, we also have these experiments within DevTools. So if there's a feature that we say, okay, we're just trying something out, we're not sure if we're going to keep this in DevTools or if it's even the right tool or if it's even useful, then we can still build it and add it behind the flag so that it doesn't appear in DevTools by default, but developers can go to their DevTools, open the settings, and then go to experiments and opt into the experiment first. So it's not exactly A/B testing or anything like that, but it gives the developers a way to play around with new ideas that we're trying out and to give early feedback. And one of my favorite examples of such an experiment is actually the CSS overview that Paul implemented recently. Everyone watching the live stream should really just go and check it out because there's no way to explain this in words that does justice to what you would see. It analyzes your page's styles and gives you an overview of all the different colors that you're using, all the different font sizes, all the media queries that appear in your page. And this kind of thing is really useful if you have something like a style guide that you want to adhere to. Because maybe you're using a slightly wrong shade of blue on one line of your CSS, but everything else is fine. And this tool will help you figure that out. So check out the experiment.
Yet another angle for you. When you look at something like Lighthouse, which we ship as part of the DevTools now, that didn't start out live inside of DevTools. That started out live in a separate repo. It was an extension and a CLI that Paul Irish and I started with it, and then it sort of rapidly changed and grew, and we started to see the developers were actually using it and giving us feedback and thoughts and so on. And eventually it made sense to integrate that into the audits panel, and then it recently got a rename, so it now actually shows up in the DevTools UI. Instead of under audits, it now shows up as Lighthouse directly. So that was another path where that grew organically, and then we integrated it into the DevTools later. So that's another take on it as well.
Okay. Paul, I have to re-ask you again of answering a question because I got the feedback that audio was not available when you answered the question about the DevTools and the IDE features. So the question we're getting more and more IDE features like editing files.
Good.
Interesting to know how you think that will continue and develop.
That's actually kind of good because I was thinking as my answer came out, there are other ways that I could answer this, but I'll give it another shot.
Different answer. Let's go.
No, yeah, completely different answer. That doesn't sound like the first one. No, the first answer I think is the actual truth, which is when we try and, like I said, I think before, if you look at something like code editors, they've changed. Like people were using Sublime or whatever before, and then everybody seemed to move to VS Code. And so the world of web development changes an awful lot and very quickly. And so the way that we integrate with it changes fairly quickly as well. And so it's not necessarily a case of saying, this is our known path. This is the path we're going to go down. Because a lot of the time we're looking at the trends and we're looking at, like Peter said earlier, we look at Twitter. We also go to conferences and we also just try and have conversations with lots of different types of developers and different walks of life. And that hopefully gives us a sense of what the needs are. And if the needs take us in a certain direction, then that's the direction in which we will go. So while it is very tempting to say, yes, we should definitely add this feature or that feature or the other, it's a lot of engineering time to put to something if it's not actually what the developer community needs. So I think all I would say is we're always trying to be open to the feedback, to iterate on DevTools, and it goes in the direction that it needs to. I think, again, if you rewind the clock 5 years, would you have expected the Chrome DevTools to look like they would today? No, they probably wouldn't. But at the same time, we try and walk a line between responding to people and also trying to make sure that we have features in there even before loads of sites have them. I'll give you an example of that one. Progressive web apps. We knew that PWAs were a thing that we were keen to support. And those features were probably in DevTools, I would imagine, much before the browser support was there. And that was partly because you have a chicken and egg problem sometimes with these things. If you can't debug the technology, then it's harder for developers to use that technology, so they tend not to use the technology, right? But on the other side, you want to make sure that you don't overinvest in tooling for a technology if it's not actually the right fit for your developers. So again, I'm saying a lot of words, but what I'm trying to say is that we're walking a fine line of trying to respond to user needs, also make provision for the things that we think are going to be necessary and popular. And that just means it's very difficult for us to say, well, in 6 months, that's exactly what we're going to do, because sometimes we just have to play it a little bit and see what happens. Which is why it's important that we have all those things about experiments and extensions and all those other ways of trying things out. Yes.
Nailed it.
Please tell me they had the audio this time.
Yes. Didn't get any different feedback. So it's already more than 45 minutes past. So let's close this out by a last question, which is a good open question, I think. So to all of you, what do you think has been the most and the hardest challenging task building and maintaining in DevTools?
Yeah. Who do you want to answer first? I think you should nominate people.
Okay, let's go for you, Mathias.
Oh, okay. Now I need to think. No, for me, what is the most simultaneously the most interesting, but also the most challenging about working on DevTools is that depending on the feature that you want to implement, you might end up interfacing with all kinds of different parts of Chrome. Like DevTools is really where everything else in Chrome comes together. It can be that you need to fix a bug in DevTools or add a new feature, and you end up working on V8, or you end up working on the Blink renderer, like that happened with the vision deficiency simulation, for example. I had never touched the Blink renderer before, but there you go. We have to implement the feature there now. So that is really challenging, but also super interesting, because you learn about all these little corners within Chromium that you otherwise wouldn't even touch.
So, Paul, what do you think? You were the second one. You had some time to think about.
I'm just going to say Mathias stole my answer. No, he didn't really. Although that is actually, if I had to pick, I would have actually said that. I think more kind of close to home for me is a bit about what I touched on earlier, that we are looking at a code base, a big code base, and even with the best tools in the world, you do have a lot of change in that code base, and it has to be managed well. And that's not just about the code. There are people whose lives, are affected when you go and change a product like DevTools or Chrome. And it's just about making sure that you do the decent thing and the right and the responsible thing. But I guess Mathias was saying the same thing. The most challenging things are actually the most rewarding things as well in some ways, because when you get it right, you know that you're actually making somebody's day better. You're building tools that they love. You're building tools that they value. And that's an incredibly rewarding thing, even if you have to sometimes just kind of get a bigger perspective or do something that you're a bit uncomfortable with in terms of like, I don't know this code. I'm not as comfortable in this space. I have to go and learn about what this means. Those are all challenges, and they add to your day. But then you come out the other side of it, and actually you've grown an awful lot, and hopefully you've brought maybe one or two other people with you on that journey as well, and that's just hugely rewarding.
So I nominate as next Peter, like from the UX perspective. I'm curious about your answer about the hardest and most challenging task building and maintaining the DevTools.
Yeah. So definitely everything that's security related is like super hard from a UX perspective. First of all, like understanding it yourself, because it's so incredibly complicated. And then the next problem is often where to surface this. Like often when something security related happens, like something gets blocked, like an iframe, a cookie, or maybe like even a new window you open, you don't really know that it's happening because of security policies. You just get a null return. And the developer like working on this also like probably doesn't know how this happens. And this is incredibly difficult to communicate because the underlying concepts are very hard to understand. It's like you would need like a long pager explanation. And it's also hard to detect when this happens and to be useful in this moment and to explain to the developer, hey, this is happening because of a new security policy Chrome uses. I think this is really, really hard. At least this gives me headaches sometimes.
Kim, what do you think? What's in your opinion and in your perspective, what has been the most challenging and hardest part building and maintaining the DevTools?
This also relates to Mathias and Paul with frontends and backends. So basically, I'm pretty new to the team, and for me, it's not only looking at DevTools frontend, but also at the backend when I actually debug bugs that come up while I'm doing wasm debugging. So I have to first understand what's happening in the front end, and then I have to see what's happening in CDP, what is sent back and forth, and then I have to see where it's happening in the back end and what is going wrong in the back end or in the front end. So it's actually a lot of different things to consider together in order to be able to catch that bug and to write a test for that.
All right. So Paul, I'm having another question to you. It's audio related. No, we got the feedback from Kerstin. Perfect audio quality for Paul's last question. So no need.
I didn't realize I was going to be such a problematic person today. Paul, if you could repeat the answer to that, because we had no sound. Anyway, that's today.
Sometimes it happens.
Yeah.
All right, so let's close it out. Thank you very much, Kim, Peter, Matthias, and Paul, for your time, for answering the questions. I'm curious about your feedback as well, and to all the ones who watched the live stream and will watch the video later on. This is like the second episode of the so-called JS Kongress Meets Friends series. And we want to improve, like based on your feedback. So I think compared to the first version, it's been better from the quality, from the technical descriptions. We did some technical deep dive, which was one of the feedback you wished. So please leave a comment on Twitter, on the comments in the chat. And that's it for today. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.